everyone, and welcome back to a new school year. I hope that yours got off to a stellar and wonderful, spectacular start. I had the wonderful pleasure of talking to many of you this summer and within the last couple of weeks, just to chat about what you saw as some challenges coming up and what you were excited about starting. So I too am excited as Director of Government Relations here at SAANYS. I think that this new school year may provide an opportunity statewide with the changes that are happening in Albany between the new legislature last year that came into session, as well as all of the changes at state education, that we may have an opportunity to really re-examine some complex issues that we continue to deal with in maybe a new light. For example, maybe we can look at high school diploma exit criteria differently. I think we'll be looking at state aid formula. I think we might be able to look at APPR a little bit differently, but more to come on all of those as we take this journey of the next school year together. The purpose of this video is to very quickly summarize the Board of Regents meeting that was held this week in Albany on Monday and Tuesday. I don't think that the Board of Regents can say that they thought that their year got off in a very stellar way. The first thing that hit them coming back to the Board of Regents meeting in September was at least 100 and probably 200 protesters that really packed the halls of state ed and enveloped the state education department. So while the morning of the first day was transpiring, there were loud chants and loud singing, as well as pounding on windows and doors and barricading entrances and exits, which was distracting. But the Regents really held firm and really wanted to focus in on the work that they had to do. The protests were about the not allowing religious exemptions anymore for vaccinations. And what's interesting about that is that really isn't a state education issue at all. Due to the measles outbreak, the legislature enacted a law that said there would be no more religious exemptions. And that's not to say that state ed did or did not support that bill, but regardless, that was the legislature action. And further, the regulations that implemented that law were developed by the Department of Health. So this really was not an education issue, except that the vaccinations were needed for students prior to entering school. So just a very interesting day all around, but I'm going to take an opportunity to maybe highlight just a few of the major items that were discussed. The first one was a discussion on a study that State Ed commissioned and was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Excuse me while I read the title, but after I do, you'll see why I'm reading this title. What success looks like for high schools that have dramatically improved and or consistently surpassed the New York State graduation rate for young men of color. Never let it be said that research likes short titles. This study looked at 10 schools throughout New York State. And as you will see on this slide, these 10 schools really did outperform the state average for graduation of young men of color. So what did the researchers find? I think you will concur that many of these were things that we have heard in much research prior. I think the difference is that these schools really enacted many of these research components with a great deal of energy. So one of the findings was that these schools certainly had a clear mission statement and a very clear vision of where they were heading. They absolutely executed with fidelity, and the implementation was monitored consistently with the right data. Further, the amount of support systems that were in place were unbelievable, that these districts, in fact, tried to eke out every kind of resource from state and local funds as well as the community to make sure that they had a systems of supports to ensure that no one student fell in any kind of crack, which goes along with another research finding that they insisted and cultivated a culture where the theory was just no child will fail here. And so what was interesting was the discussion then that followed this, the research findings. Regent Johnson asked whether the resources were the same across all the 10 schools. And of course, the researcher said no. But again, the difference was the doggedness with which these schools garnered additional resources from any source possible. Regent Chin asked about class size and whether the research showed anything in terms of differences of class, small class, large size. Researchers said not that they had looked at specifically, but they also thought that that would not be a huge causality factor. Rather, they thought that the amount of supports that were put in place made the difference, not necessarily the size or the ratio of student to teacher in terms of instruction. Regent Tillich and Mead also asked about the community partnerships that were established. I think one of the statements made by one of the members of the board stayed with me that day as well as the rest of this week. And it was one by Regent Young. And he basically quoted Ron Edmonds. And it was a quote that said, "How many effective schools would you have to see to be persuaded of the educability of poor children?" And I think that was all to say, again, something that I led with is we have seen these research studies. We kind of know what the components of effective practices are. How much of this do we have to see before we really bring this to large scale? And he is very committed, as you well know, through his My Brother's Keeper initiative, as well as other statewide efforts that he's involved in on a continual basis to make sure that we are really keeping our focus on this particular initiative. A second item that I'd like to bring to your attention, this is very short, was the initiative that the Regents want to undertake to relook at diploma requirements and exit criteria from high schools. In July, they asked staff to bring a plan forth for this initiative, and staff did, and they talked about it, but the rollout was anticipated in July to be for 1 year. The Board of Regents clearly said to staff that no, that was way too short. They do not want a statewide effort like this to be rolled out like APPR or ESSA. So they asked staff to come back this month with a revised schedule. So instead, this examination of diploma requirement and the whole idea that if we're going to be providing alternative pathways to graduation, shouldn't there be alternative looks at what is needed to ensure that students have the competencies necessary to graduate from high school, but it may not need to be a statewide test or it could be multiple tests. That whole process is going to take until fall of 2021. But be assured that we will be at the table for all of those discussions, as well as invite you to be there as well. A third item that the Regents discussed were the results of the last year's ELA and math state assessments. I won't go into those, you've seen them all. But I do want you to look at the slide that I'm presenting at this point, because this really, I think, summarizes the entire discussion. It was a very quick look at the continual and persistent achievement gaps. Some of the discussion, I think, is very telling that went on around this very short, abbreviated agenda item. But Regent Collins asked, are we going to specifically look at the students who come back from charter schools to a public school system right before the state assessment program begins? Regent Sia asked if she could see a breakdown of the cohort of students with disability, but by disability category. Regent Cashin asked very pointedly, what are we learning from this data? Some years we see a 0.5 increase, other years we see a 0.5 decrease. So what are these tests really showing us? I think you can begin to see the seeds of relooking not only at the graduation exit criteria, but assessments in general, and what in fact are we looking at as a system that will help us provide diagnostic information as well as just basically outcomes. Another item I want to bring to your attention just very quickly was an item on inclusive athletic activities. The New York State Athletic Association with the Special Olympics created a unified sports program, which is absolutely fantastic. If you want to see a motivating video, go onto the state education website and look at the Regents material. And I will also provide a link to all of these items, as well as a further discussion in the news and notes coming out in October. But basically, this is a program where both disabled and non-disabled students play on competitive team sports. So this provides an opportunity for everybody to basically participate and bring opportunities for their work on a team. However, the original regs did not anticipate this kind of program. So what the proposed regs do is they extend the eligibility to be in these programs. So a student who is in grades 9 through 12 can participate in such teams beyond age 19, as well as beyond 4 consecutive years. One very quick item that I wanted to discuss was an item not necessarily on P12, but brought before the Board of Regents through the Cultural Education Subcommittee. And it was in regard to the 2020 census. This is a very important national effort. As you well know, the results of this determine congressional seats. They determine the distribution of funding for housing, for education, for social services programs. It is anticipated that about 80% of households in America will be participating in this. The problem is, in New York, between 18 and 22% of households do not have access to broadband. So the libraries are very, very committed to making sure that they are a place where digital privacy is in fact ensured, and that they have the supports in place to help families be able to fill out surveys and know exactly what it means about the survey itself, as well as ways to make sure that it is filled out completely. So I urge you, as this comes to your community, that you make your families aware that the libraries want and are prepared to play a very important part in the 2020 census. And then lastly, I think maybe one of the most telling parts about this Regents was what was not discussed. When we had our monthly stakeholder with Commissioner Ilya, her last one, I think it was about 4 days before she left, she had indicated that she anticipated the APPR regulations to enact the new law to go forth for the first time before the Board of Regents in September. They were not on the agenda item. And this was not a matter of them being excluded from the agenda because of the delayed 2 days due to the protests. The other thing that was not on the agenda was regulations to basically enact a guideline on substantial equivalency. As you may have read or know about, the State Education Department is proposing regulations that would make local education agencies, your districts, responsible for determining the equivalency of instruction in non-public schools. Much of the public is thinking that this was an overreach, that this is not within the scope of what your local districts can handle or do, that it's again another unfunded mandate. We concurred as well here at SAANYS and also submitted comments on these regulations indicating such that there are other ways to roll this out if equivalency of instruction of non-public schools needs to be determined in different ways. Maybe create networks, maybe create an approved list of independent evaluators, but certainly this is a burden on our local school districts, and our comments basically gave the opinion of that to the State Education Department. So that is probably not as quick as I wanted the summary to be, but I do think it gives you a sense of the kind of discussions going on at the Board of Regents. I look forward to the rest of this year and talking with you, and I hope to see many, many, many of you at the October conference. So thank you for listening and have a great day.